Steve Harvey has hosted Family Feud for over 14 years. He has laughed with thousands of families, cried with a few, and handled more awkward answers than any man alive should have to handle. He has seen elderly grandmothers say things that made the audience gasp. He has seen grown men break down without warning. He has seen children say things so honest and so unfiltered that the whole studio went quiet. He thought he had seen everything. But nothing in 14 years of live television prepared him for the moment a 96-year-old woman leaned toward his ear during what was supposed to be a lighthearted between-round chat, and whispered 4 words that made the color drain from his face. 4 words that made Steve Harvey, one of the most composed men in American entertainment, stand up straight, look directly into the nearest camera, and say in a voice that left no room for argument, "Shut the cameras, right now." If you believe that some truths change everything the moment they are spoken, make sure you like this video and subscribe to this channel before we go any further, because what that woman whispered, and what happened in the hour that followed, is one of the most deeply human stories we have ever told. Estelle Marion Harvey was 96 years old, and she carried those years the way old oak trees carry their rings, not as a burden, but as evidence. Evidence of storms survived, of seasons endured, of a root system that had gone so deep into the ground that nothing above it could topple what was below. She was Steve Harvey's mother's oldest living relative, a great-aunt by blood and a grandmother by every other measure that matters. She had been born in 1928 in Welch, West Virginia, in the same coal country that had shaped the Harvey family for generations, in a place where the mountains were beautiful and the work was brutal, and people learned early that life gave you what it gave you and you built from there. Estelle had never married. This was unusual enough in her time and place that people had wondered about it quietly for decades, and she had let them wonder without offering any explanation. She had lived alone in a small house in Cleveland, Ohio for most of her adult life, working first as a seamstress, then as a school cafeteria cook, and finally as a home health aide for elderly patients until she herself became elderly enough that people started offering to help her instead. She had no children of her own, but she had been deeply present in the lives of the children around her, feeding them, teaching them to sew, telling them stories about West Virginia that made the mountains sound like a place from a fairy tale, which in some ways they were, and in some ways they absolutely were not. She had a reputation in the family for 2 things: her cooking, which was described by everyone who had ever eaten it as the kind of food that makes you feel like the world is fundamentally okay, and her silences. Estelle Marion Harvey did not talk about the past. She was warm and funny and present in every other way, but certain questions about her youth, about her choices, about why she had never married, about specific years of her life were met with a particular quiet that the family had long since learned to respect without understanding. Some silences, the Harvey family knew, are not emptiness. They are containers. They are the shape of something being held very carefully so it does not spill. It was Steve's niece, Danielle, who had nominated Estelle for Family Feud. Danielle had been trying for 2 years to get the family to do something big for Estelle's 96th birthday, something that would take her out of her apartment and put her at the center of a celebration she would never organize for herself. Estelle had agreed to the show with the mild, gracious compliance of someone who has reached an age where surprises no longer frighten you because you have already survived every kind. She had dressed carefully the morning of the taping, a cream-colored blouse, a navy cardigan, small pearl earrings that she had owned since 1954. She looked, when she walked onto the Family Feud stage, exactly like what she was, a woman of tremendous quiet dignity who had lived a very long and very full life, most of which no one in that studio knew anything about. The Harvey family team that day was anchored by Estelle and filled out by 3 of her great nieces and nephews, all of them in their 30s and 40s, all of them visibly delighted to be there and visibly protective of the elderly woman at the center of their group. They played well. Estelle herself contributed several answers in the first 2 rounds that were so perfectly timed and so unexpectedly sharp that the audience applauded not just the answer but the delivery. She had a dry wit that she deployed with the precision of someone who had been practicing it for 9 decades. Steve was charmed by her immediately, the way he was charmed by people who had clearly decided long ago that life was too short for pretense. During the break between the 2nd and 3rd rounds, Steve did what he always did. He moved through the family, asking questions, drawing people out, finding the threads of story that make a game show feel like something more than a game show. He asked Estelle about her life in Cleveland. He asked about her work as a seamstress. He asked what the secret was to living to 96, and she said, without hesitating, Mind your business and drink your water." The audience loved that. Steve laughed the way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him. He leaned a little closer and said, "Miss Estelle, you are something else. I want to know everything about you." And Estelle Harvey looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. And then she said, very quietly, "No, you don't." And something in the way she said it made Steve go still. He had been in television long enough to know the difference between someone being modest and someone carrying weight. He had been alive long enough to know that certain silences are invitations if you are paying the right kind of attention. He pulled his chair a few inches closer to hers and lowered his voice so that it was just the two of them inside the noise of the studio. "Miss Estelle," he said gently, "what did you mean by that?" She looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked up at him. And then she leaned forward just slightly and she whispered 4 words into his ear. No one in the studio heard what she said. The boom microphones were positioned for the game, not for a whisper at close range. The audience saw Steve Harvey's face change in real time, saw the warmth and the performance and the hosting mode all dissolve at once, replaced by something raw and unscripted and completely private. They saw him sit back. They saw him press his hand flat against his chest, just for a second, as if steadying something. And then they saw him stand up, look directly into the camera closest to him, and say the words that would be replayed in clips across the internet for months afterward. "Shut the cameras right now, I mean it, shut them down." And for the first and only time in 14 years, the cameras on the Family Feud set went dark. What Estelle had whispered was this: "I know who your father is." Not "I knew your father," not "I have something to tell you about your father," but "I know who your father is," present tense, as if the question were still open. As if there were something about Broderick Harvey, the man Steve had buried in 2000. The man who had shaped more of who Steve was than perhaps anyone else in his life, that had not yet been fully understood. Steve Harvey has spoken publicly about his father many times over the years. He has described Broderick Harvey Sr. as the foundation of everything. He built a quiet, principled man who worked at a funeral home and raised his children with a combination of sternness and deep, abiding love. Steve has said that his father taught him to look people in the eye, to work without complaint, to find dignity in any kind of honest labor. The loss of his father in 2000 was one of the defining griefs of Steve's life, and he had spoken about it with the particular tenderness of someone who knows they were loved well by someone who is no longer there to love them. So when Estelle Marion Harvey, who had known Broderick Harvey for his entire adult life, who had watched Steve grow up, who had been present at family gatherings and funerals and birthdays for 9 decades, whispered that she knew who Steve's father was, the implication was clear, and it landed on Steve Harvey like something falling from a great height. In the production room that had been quickly cleared for privacy, with only a producer, a legal representative the show kept on call, and Danielle, who held Estelle's hand throughout, Steve sat across from his 96-year-old great-aunt and listened to a story that had begun before he was born. Estelle spoke slowly and carefully with the precision of someone who has organized this information in their mind many times over many decades and is now simply reading from a document they have memorized completely. She did not apologize for telling it. She did not dramatize it. She told it the way she cooked, with patience, with attention to what mattered and without wasting anything. The story was this. In the early 1950s, in the West Virginia coal country where both she and Steve's mother had grown up, there had been a man. Not Broderick Harvey. A man whose name Estelle gave carefully, explaining first who he was in the community, what kind of person he had been, and what had happened between him and Steve's mother during a period of her life that predated her marriage. Steve's mother had been very young. The situation had been complicated in the way that situations involving young women and older men in positions of community standing are always complicated, which is to say that the complication had been borne almost entirely by the younger person. When Steve's mother had discovered she was pregnant, she had been terrified, and it had been Estelle, 20-something Estelle, sharp and practical and fiercely loyal to her niece, who had helped her navigate what came next. What came next was Broderick Harvey, who had known, who had married Steve's mother with full knowledge of what he was taking on, who had chosen deliberately and with clear eyes to be the father of a child that was not biologically his, and who had then proceeded to be, by every account and by Steve's own testimony, one of the finest fathers a child could have. Broderick Harvey had never told Steve. Steve's mother had never told Steve. And Estelle had kept the secret for over 60 years because she had believed, with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had watched Broderick Harvey love that boy from the day he was born, that the truth would only take something away and give nothing back. But Estelle was 96 years old. She had outlived nearly everyone who had known the original story. She had sat with it for 6 decades, and she had decided, with the quiet authority of someone who answers to no one at this point in their life, that Steve Harvey deserved to know. Not because it changed anything about Broderick Harvey, not because it diminished a single moment of what that man had given his son, but because Steve Harvey was a man who had built his entire life and his entire public identity on the foundation of knowing who he was and where he came from. And Estelle had believed for years, and believed more strongly with every year that passed that a man had the right to the full truth of his own story, even when the full truth was complicated, even when it arrived late, even when it arrived from a 96-year-old woman in a cream blouse at a game show taping in Los Angeles. Steve Harvey sat in that production room for a long time after Estelle finished speaking. Danielle, who was crying quietly, kept her hand over her great aunts and did not say anything. The producer and the legal representative had stepped back against the wall and were doing the right thing, which was nothing. Steve looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked at Estelle. He said eventually, "Did my mother know that you were going to tell me this?" Estelle said. "Your mother has been gone for 6 years. It was her secret to tell first. She chose not to. Now it is my choice." Steve nodded slowly. He said, "And Broderick, my dad, did he ever talk to you about it?" Estelle said. "Once, a long time ago. He said the boy was his son. He said it the way people say something that is simply true. He was not interested in discussing it further." Steve nodded again. He was quiet for another long moment. And then he said, "He was my dad." Estelle said, "Yes, he was. That part was never in question." And something in the way she said it, with the flat, certain kindness of someone who has carried this story for 60 years and knows exactly what its core is, and what its edges are, seemed to settle something in the room. He asked her questions for about 40 minutes. He was thorough and he was calm, which Estelle later told Danielle she had expected, because she had always thought Steve Harvey was more like Broderick than people realized. He asked about the man whose name she had given him, whether he was still alive, whether he had any other children, whether there was anything she knew about the medical history that might be relevant. He asked about his mother as a young woman, and Estelle told him things that made him smile twice and look away once. He asked Estelle why she had decided to tell him now today on a game show. She said, "I did not plan to tell you today. I planned to tell you privately. But then you sat down next to me and you asked me to tell you everything about myself, and I looked at your face, and you look so much like him, the other one, that I thought, today, it has to be today, while I am still here to say it." Steve looked at her for a long moment. "You've been waiting for the right moment," he said. Estelle said, "I have been waiting for the courage. There is a difference." He reached over and took her hand. He held it for a while without saying anything. When Steve walked back out onto the Family Feud stage, the cameras were back on, and the audience had been told only that there had been a personal family matter that needed a few minutes of privacy. The family team was still there. Estelle walked out beside Steve, small and straight in her navy cardigan, and the audience applauded with the warmth of people who did not know exactly what had happened, but could feel that something real and significant had passed through the room. Steve stood at the podium for a moment before saying anything. Then he said, "I need to say something to this woman right here." He turned to Estelle. "I have spent my entire career talking about my dad, telling people what he meant to me, what he taught me, what he gave me, and every single word of that was true, every word, because the man who raised me was my father, full stop. That does not change today, and it will not change tomorrow, and it will not change ever. But I also want to say," he paused, and his voice shifted into the lower register it went to when he was not performing but simply speaking, "that the truth is a gift, even when it arrives wrapped in something hard. And I am grateful. I'm grateful for the woman standing next to me, who is the bravest 96-year-old I have ever known, which is saying something because I have known some brave 96-year-olds. The audience laughed through what were clearly, for many of them, tears. Estelle patted his arm. The remainder of the taping that day became something that none of the production staff had ever experienced before and would describe for years afterward. It was not a normal game show episode. It was not a tribute episode or a tearjerker special. It was something rarer and harder to categorize. It was honest. Steve played the rest of the game with Estelle's family, and he was fully present in a way that went beyond hosting. He asked questions that were real questions. He listened to answers the way you listen when you know that the person speaking is telling you something that matters. At one point, during a break, he sat on the edge of the stage and just talked with Estelle, not for the cameras, not for the audience, just talked, and the audience sat quietly and watched the way you watch something that belongs to someone else, but that you are grateful to be near. After the taping, Steve spent 3 more hours at the studio with Estelle and Danielle. He arranged for Estelle to be taken back to her hotel in a car rather than the production van, because he wanted her to be comfortable. He called a family member that night, his voice low, and had a long conversation that neither party has spoken about publicly. He looked up the name Estelle had given him and found what he expected to find. A man long dead, from West Virginia, with a face that he stared at on a genealogy website for a while before closing the laptop and going to stand at the window of his hotel room and look at the lights of Los Angeles for a long time. In the weeks that followed, Steve talked about the experience in careful, measured terms in a few interviews. He did not disclose the full content of what Estelle had told him that remained private, shared only with close family, but he spoke about what it had meant to him in a broader sense. He said that he had spent his life believing that Broderick Harvey had made him who he was, and that that belief had not changed by 1 degree. He said that a man who chooses to love a child, who shows up every day and does the work of fatherhood with intention and consistency, is a father in every way that matters. He said that biology was a fact, but that fatherhood was a decision, and that Broderick Harvey had made that decision every single day for the entirety of Steve's life, and that he honored him for it more, not less, now that he knew the full story. He also said something that the people who heard it quoted back to him for a long time afterward. He said, "Miss Estelle gave me a gift, and the gift was not the secret. The gift was the reminder that the people who love you are capable of doing something extraordinary on your behalf, and then saying nothing about it for 60 years. My dad did that, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of something that quiet and that big." He said it simply, without performance, and it landed the way true things land when they are spoken by someone who means every word. Estelle Marion Harvey returned to Cleveland. She went back to her apartment, her small routines, her window that faced the street, her habit of making a full Sunday dinner even though there was no one to cook it for except herself and whoever stopped by. She did not talk about what she had done at the Family Feud taping, not publicly, not in any way that sought recognition or attention. She was not that kind of person. She had done what she believed needed to be done, and she had done it for reasons that were entirely her own, and that was enough for her. When Danielle asked her a few weeks later how she felt about having told Steve the truth, she thought about it for a moment and then said, "Lighter." That was all, just that one word. Lighter. She died the following spring quietly in her apartment in Cleveland at 96 years old. She had lived long enough to see Steve at Christmas, when he had come to Cleveland specifically to visit her, and had sat in her kitchen eating the food she cooked and talking to her the way people talk when they know they are talking to someone who does not have unlimited time. He brought her flowers. She told him he did not need to bring flowers. He said he knew that, but he wanted to. She accepted them and put them in a vase on the windowsill, and they sat in the afternoon light and ate together, and said the kinds of things that people say when what they really mean is, "I am glad you are here, and I am glad I got to know you," and some things do not need to be said more precisely than that. When Steve spoke about Estelle after her death, he said that she had been one of the most remarkable people he had ever encountered, and that the particular kind of courage she had shown, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that gets parades, but the slow, patient courage of someone who carries something for 60 years and then, at 96, decides that the time has come, was the kind of courage he most respected and least fully understood. He said he thought about her often. He said he thought about Broderick Harvey often too, in a way that had shifted since the taping, deepened somehow, the way a color deepens when you change the light. He said his father had done something extraordinary, had carried something without complaint, had loved without reservation, and had built a man out of that love who was still standing. He said that was the whole story. He said that was enough. There is a version of this story that is only about secrets, about who knew what and when, about biology and DNA and the complicated machinery of family history. But that is not the story that the people who were in that room on the day of the taping remember. They remember a 96-year-old woman in a cream blouse and pearl earrings deciding that the man across from her deserved the full truth of his own life. They remember Steve Harvey sitting with something hard and heavy and finding, at the bottom of it, something that made him love his father more rather than less. They remember Danielle holding her great-aunt's hand in a cleared-out production room in Los Angeles while something that had been sealed for 60 years finally opened. And they remember that it was okay, that the truth, however long it waited, was received with enough love that it did not break anything. It only deepened what was already there. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that love is a choice, and that some silences are the bravest things people ever do, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. We will keep telling the stories that remind you what people are truly capable of when it matters most.